Hello and welcome to Deep Conversations and Explorations. For our fifth episode on biology, we sat down with Dr. Raymond Tallis. Dr. Tallis is a philosopher, poet, novelist, and cultural critic, and was until recently a physician and a clinical scientist. He was listed as one of the top living polymaths in the world in 2009 in the Economist's Intelligent Life magazine. He trained as a doctor at Oxford University before going on to become Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester and a consultant physician in the healthcare of the elderly in Salford. Over the last 20 years, Dr. Talis has published fiction, 3 volumes of poetry, and 23 books on the philosophy of mind, philosophical anthropology, literary theory, the nature of art, and cultural criticism. Among his many books are Aping Mankind, In Defense of Wonder, and The Mystery of Being Human. We talked about his philosophy of biology, consciousness in conventional biology, what Darwinism tells us about consciousness, how and why we need to acknowledge the extraordinary distinctive nature of human beings, how biology can serve as a reminder of how much we have in common with other creatures, biological immortality, scientism, neuroscientism, and the problems with both, what wonder means to him, free will, determinism, and gender as a biological construct. We hope this conversation can help listeners see the tattva, or the true essence of biology, and its potential to help us understand how life came to be and the various ways in which it evolves with and through humans as well as all other living beings.
Good afternoon, Professor Tallis. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us, Tatvadeep. And today we want to talk to you about your work, your understanding of biology, and your work as a philosopher of biology, and a few other things.
First of all, can I say thank you very much for having me? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. The first question that we want to ask you is, what is biology?
It's the study of living creatures, essentially, coming from the Greek bios, which is life, and logos, which refers to generally studies. Yeah.
Thank you. And what is your philosophy of biology?
I think I focus very much on how we as human beings are and are not defined biology, how we are, yes, part of nature to some extent, but in another sense, distance from nature. And most of my books have been really devoted to specifying that distance, the difference we are from all other living creatures, at the same time trying to give some kind of explanation of how that distance arose, how we are different, profoundly different, even from our nearest primate kin, like chimpanzees and gorillas and so on.
You have spoken about the experiments conducted by Jane Goodall with chimpanzees, and you have spoken how near that species has come to being human beings in some of your podcasts, some of your interviews earlier. Could you give us an experiment of this gap between us and the primates?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't see Jane Goodall as an experimental researcher. Most of her research has been out in the field, simply observing these creatures, observing with an amazing eye that she has, an amazing commitment. I mean, she's been out there for decades looking at these creatures. And essentially, she is a good guide to what they are like. And actually, she has made several observations that really flag up the extent to which even sophisticated primates like chimpanzees, gorillas, and so on are fundamentally different from us. But one of the points she makes in one of her books, and I can't remember which one it is, Gorillas in the Mist, I suspect, is to say that by observing the ways in which other primates are different from us, we become, as it were, aware of our own nature. It's a bit like when you travel abroad, you discover your own country. It's the same kind of process.
Okay.
Sorry, yes.
When we build things, so then we come to building computers. which are becoming more and more like humans. At least that's what people talk about, artificial intelligence and robotics. Now, one of the things that you talk about is how we are giving the names, terminologies to these functions that we use. And could you please explain to us why you're against it? What is the point of, what is the point that you're trying to convey to us? And why that is dangerous or not right, and what is the right way to go about?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to give out about one of my long-standing preoccupations. Yes, there is the assumption somehow, there are several assumptions. One is that we are our brains and that our brains are essentially computers. So sooner or later, if we can make a computer that is as complex as our brains, we will make something rather like ourselves. And there have been prophets of science, as it were, who have claimed that within 20 or 30 years, there will be computers so sophisticated that they won't even treat us like household pets, all that sort of stuff. Well, I have to say they're going to be disappointed. And the reason they're disappointed is, first of all, we are not just our brains. Secondly, our brains aren't just computers, that the so-called wetware of the brain is not comparable in any way to either the hardware or the software seen in computers. And thirdly, there are the empirical facts that basically ever more complex computers using different designs, different architectures, have not brought us anywhere near to something that has features that are absolutely central to ourselves, namely consciousness. Basically, your pocket calculator is no more or less conscious than basically massive computers with gigabytes of RAM and so on and so forth. There's been no progress towards consciousness as computers have become more cunningly designed and more complex. But it's so easy to imagine that. You may be familiar with a recent 2 or 3 years ago wave of excitement because of a computer that managed to beat the world champion at a game called Go. Now, the game is extraordinarily complicated, and this computer called AlphaGo beat the world champion. But of course, that computer wasn't playing Go. What the computer was an instrument that the scientists were using to play Go against the world champion. The computer didn't make its own way to the hall where they had the competition. It had no idea what it was doing. It had no idea of victory. And I'm sure it didn't go for a celebratory drink after it had after it had beaten the world champion. One of the problems is we sometimes confuse the tools we use with ourselves who use them. And it's to say that a computer plays Go is as daft as to say that a hammer hammers in a nail. Of course, the hammer doesn't hammer in a nail. We use a hammer to hammer in a nail. The hammer has no sense of what a nail is, or indeed the purpose of nailing the nail. So there you are, already you've got me going. It's something that I find exasperating, that people, as it were, ascribe to computers the motions, the intentions, and so on of those who design them and use them for various purposes. Yeah.
That's interesting. When we talk about building computers, we are able to, or at least there are point of view. Your point of view is it can never happen because computers don't do it. We build computers, therefore they compute and manifest things in the world. But instead of building computers, if you can build social systems, how much impact does that do on biology and also outcomes, social outcomes? So the question could be like this. What do you think are the social outcomes based on the right understanding of biology and science and the wrong understanding of biology and science today, according to you as a biologist?
I mean, they are very broad questions, but one way of approaching it is to say, Well, are we obliged to think of ourselves as human beings, merely as organisms? Organisms that were produced by evolutionary processes, the organism Homo sapiens and so on? Or are we more than organisms? And what I would say is we are indeed more than organisms. Basically, Darwin's theory explains how the organism Homo sapiens arose, but it doesn't account for the emergence of conscious persons, of conscious subjects. Really, Darwinism has nothing to say about or to offer an explanation for the emergence of consciousness, or indeed the value of consciousness. I've often thought that if you were serious about survival, the survival of a gene that's replicating, the last thing you want to do is to make the phenotype conscious, because consciousness is a bit of a dodgy, wobbly business, whereas mechanisms are unbreakable. So if I was basically wanting to produce an organism that is going to survive, then I would make sure it had good mechanisms rather than that it had consciousness and conscious choices. So we have problems with understanding the very nature of consciousness within the framework of conventional biology, its nature, how it arose, and what function it serves. Now you may say, well, is that terribly important? But I think if we think we are just beasts, we're more likely to treat each other like beasts and perhaps to behave in a beastly fashion. Acknowledging and recognizing the extraordinary distinctive nature of humanity seems to me is an important underpinning of treating each other not like beasts, but as human beings. Which is not to say that I believe that we humans were separately handmade by a creator and the rest of the natural world was created on other occasions. I don't have a supernatural understanding of what we are, but I don't have a purely naturalistic understanding of what we are. The view I've developed in dozens of books, literally dozens, alas, the view I've developed in dozens of books has been of ourselves as extra-natural, outside of nature, not above it, not handmade by God, but not completely dissolved into it. We are curious creatures, as curious as basically a fish that could say the word fish or say the word ocean. We can stand outside of ourselves and our environment to discuss, observe, explore ourselves. And that's what makes us different. And acknowledging that difference and the richness of humanity that becomes evident once you acknowledge it, it seems to me an important part of our being human beings.
To sum up biology, if you can sum up what it is telling us as something about ourselves.
Well, it is a reminder of, and certainly the kind of biology that I've been involved in, applied biology, otherwise known as medicine. I was a doctor for 40 years. It reminds of how much we have in common with other creatures. After all, the medicine I practiced depended an awful lot on information we've obtained from other species. Without experimental medicine on other species, the medicine that I practiced in my 40 years would have been no further advanced than medicine in medieval times. So we are always reminded that our unique human nature does depend on the adequate functioning of ourselves as biological structures, biological organisms. So much is going on in my body at the moment, which is necessary for me to be able to communicate with you. But most of what's going on in my body is A, unknown to me, and B, very similar to what is happening in the bodies of non-human species. So for example, thank heavens my kidneys are working. They're happily working away even as we speak, making sure that my fluid balance is okay and my sodium levels are all right and potassium levels are all right. All of these impersonal, pre-personal, apersonal things are necessary for our personal existence, but they do not define and limit our personal existence, except insofar as without them, we wouldn't be able to live.
The next question to you is, what are biologists working towards? For them, what according to biologists would be a better choice in making the world a better place?
I'm not too sure I can speak for all biologists, which must be a community of millions and millions of people studying everything from microorganisms right through to the behavior of primates. So I don't think there's a single answer to that. I think there's two things that biologists, if they want to have a practical application of their work, and some of them don't necessarily, they just love the organisms they study. But if they did want to have a practical application of their work, I think one would be to improve the condition of our lives, health and so on and so forth. And perhaps some biologists have this dream that by cracking the secret of life, there are many secrets of life, of course, they would somehow enable us to live forever. This is the dream of those who would seek a biological immortality. I think it's unlikely to happen for all sorts of reasons. And I've had many discussions with the fantasists who believe that we can somehow so alter our organism as to be able to give it eternal life.
Is there a way, is it a possibility in what science is offering us today as second life in metaverse? Is that what they're talking about, eternal life? Is there a way to interpret it that way?
Well, there are two sorts of approaches in the pursuit of immortality. One is indeed to improve our biological kit and to look at the processes that happen during aging and to see if we can stop or reverse those processes. And some of those working on that area have made extraordinarily exaggerated claims. There's one particular biologist, I won't mention his name, with whom I've had many discussions, who said that the 60-year-old who's going to live to be 1,000 is walking amongst us today. And his argument goes as follows. He says, we will discover some method of prolonging life. That will then buy time for us to discover an even better method of prolonging life. And that'll buy more time to get the drift. Well, I have to say most of the things that he believes will prolong life may actually produce all sorts of other adverse effects in the human body. So that's one approach. One is to make the biological organism more enduring, but it's never going to lead to eternal life. I feel it's very unlikely it'll lead to a life of 200 or 300 years, never mind eternal life. Having said that, one's always got to be conscious, or cautious rather, when one's saying that things are impossible. Let me give you an example. I can imagine myself sitting in a hall in 1890, and somebody's saying, you know, in 100 years' time, they're going to invent a device that you can hold in your hand, and basically I can talk to somebody in India without raising my voice. And I would fall about laughing, saying how ridiculous. And of course, we've got mobile phones. So always a bit cautious about saying something is not possible in the future. But I feel pretty confident that the mechanisms for extending the life of the biological organism, as suggested by some of those in that field, are unlikely to deliver much in the way of life extension. And certainly eternity is not on the cards. The other approach is saying, actually, the biological organism is not a very good host for human consciousness. What we really need is to load up the information systems, so-called, that corresponding to the human mind, and load them up onto more enduring substrates, onto hard disks, which can then be replicated indefinitely. So you take Raymond Tallis, you extract from him the information that corresponds to Raymond Tallis's mind, and you load that information onto a hard disk, and there he is living on. Two problems with that. One is he's not just information. And secondly, in order for Raymond Tallis to live on in his world, you'd have to load up the rest of his world as well. Otherwise, it'd be a jolly lonely business, being the information corresponding to Raymond Tallis when nothing else, as it were, was transported with him or transputed with him. So the dream of improving our health incrementally, and more importantly, making the gains in healthcare and health more widely available, that to me is a totally honorable dream and a realizable, leaving aside the problems of politics. But the dream or nightmare or fantasy that we should be able to, as it were, be liberated from biology and load up our minds onto more enduring stuff, such as hard disks, I'm afraid that is fantasy and based on a fundamental metaphysical misunderstanding of what it is to be a conscious human being.
That you call as a wrong understanding of science?
Well, it's a wrong understanding of what we are, and probably therefore the capabilities of science. I mean, all my career, I was an applied scientist, a doctor, and also a neuroscientist. So you won't be surprised to learn that I admire science enormously for two reasons. One is it enables us to make astonishing predictions of huge scope and precision, which would be impossible without all the advances in science. And the second thing is that it has been applied in the creation of artifacts which have made our lives longer, safer, etc., leaving aside artifacts used in war. We live in a landscape of artifacts that express or that realize applied science. So I have no problem with science. My problem is something else, with scientism, which is the belief not merely that science will give us a clue about manipulating the material world, but that science essentially tells us what we are and also tells us what we ought to be or what we ought to aim for. And alas, I don't think science explains our nature. One of the reasons for that is the process by which we do perform scientific investigation requires us to set ourselves aside. The subject has to get out of the way in order to make an objective measurement. No wonder we disappear as science advances. If you think about that fantastic equation, E equals mc squared, everybody knows that equation. And what does it tell us? It tells us very little, but it does tell us how we could manipulate one thing, produce another outcome. It lies behind nuclear power and the atom bomb for a start. But actually, what does it tell you about yourself? Do you learn anything about yourself by learning there's a relationship between energy, mass, and the speed of light multiplied by itself? Not at all. So as science becomes more powerful, as it becomes more general and more fundamental, so humanity disappears. So science is unlikely to tell us much about ourselves, but of course it tells us an awful lot about the material world and also how to manipulate it to make our lives more comfortable, safe, and so on.
So if these pertinent questions, answers to these pertinent questions lie beyond science, where do you suggest man should go, or common person should go to get these answers?
Well, I've often thought that Wittgenstein had it right, the Austro-German philosopher who came to England and became professor of philosophy at Cambridge, a name very familiar, probably one of the two greatest philosophers of the 20th century. And Wittgenstein said, don't think, look. So the first thing to do is to look about you. And most of my books have been devoted to reminding people of the profound variety, complexity, profundity of just the world around us. I came upon a lovely quotation yesterday from Robert Louis Stevenson, who is a Scottish novelist of the last century, no, 19th century. Yes, 19th century. And he said that there is more richness of human consciousness than in the whole works of Shakespeare. Now, I happen to adore Shakespeare, but she's right. Oh, he's right, rather, Robert Louis Stevenson. So the first thing is to look at the richness of the world around us. And then to think about those constraints we operate within, what it is that shapes our actions, what it is that shapes our ambitions, our hopes, and so on and so forth. Now, some of that will take the form of psychology, some will take the form of sociology, but some will require to dig deeper and into philosophy, particularly in focusing on my own interests in metaphysics, the philosophy that says, how should we understand our nature? What is space? What is time? Etc., etc. Where does ought come from in a world of is? These are the kinds of questions we need to ask. And in this case, the armchair, much despised, in which you sit and think, is probably a more useful instrument than, let us say, I don't know, an accelerator, a large hadron collider at CERN. Yeah.
You have spoken about the hand, the human hand, and the upright position, and the outward gaze, the three things.
Yes.
And suddenly this hand has become such exquisite tool. So as we progress with technology progressing alongside, what do you think is going to happen to the biological processes, and do you see them evolving?
Well, can I just talk a little bit about the hand, because and then I can come to your question.
Yes.
Those of us like me who believe that Darwin's theory explained how the human organism came into being, Homo sapiens, but don't believe that Darwin's theory explains the nature of the human person, I've got a job to do. We've got to explain basically how we got to be so different. So we have a personhood quite different from the consciousness or the life of our nearest primate kin. So there's the question, how do we get to be so different? And in the book on the hand, which is part of a trilogy on human consciousness and human nature, which you referred to, I identify the hand as one of the drivers to our difference. And why the hand? Well, let's go back 5 million years, and let's remember what happened about 5 million years ago, which there was massive climate change, and primates, who are the immediate ancestors of hominids, left the jungle and came into the savannah. They adopted, for this reason, the upright position. And that liberated their forelimbs from being locomotor props, suddenly to having other possibilities. But at the same time, the human hand changed in a way that made it much more versatile. There was opposability of the thumb and index finger. There was increased sensitivity of the fingers. There was increased capacity to have what's called fractionated finger movement. And this was all combined with the dominance then of vision. Instead of smell and the immediate senses, touch, basically the hand, the vision became important. So suddenly the combination of this extraordinarily versatile hand and vision, which can regulate it and so on, opened up new possibilities for primates that became hominids. And the hand then became a very important organ of manipulation, an important organ of cognition. It's the chief organ of the fifth sense, and also of communication. Here I am waving to you now. And the hand became a very, very important organ of communication. And for some evolutionary anthropologists, they feel that it was the origin of language, the language I'm using now. And I use the hand as an example of how, as it were, we can escape the Darwinian constraints on being merely biological organisms to become the strange creatures that we are, these conscious subjects that we are. One final point about the hand is that the way we use it makes it what Aristotle would call the tool of tools. That's to say, we're conscious of it as an agent of our agency. And so in the book, I talk at considerable length about how the hand inspired tools. One final point on that, if you think about how things were for chimpanzees 5 million years ago, what was their top technological achievement? Well, probably using a stone to crack a nut or doing a bit of termite fishing. 5 million years later, what is there now? What is their achievement now? Oh, to use a stone to crack a nut, to do a little bit of termite fishing. Contrast that with us. 200 years ago, steam engine, or 300 years ago, was the steam engine, was the cutting edge of technology. And now we have nuclear power, and what's something I've referred to before is these extraordinary mobile phones that enable us to talk to people thousands of miles away without raising our voice. So in a way, it is the hand as the tool of tools that gives us a different sense of ourselves and our agency that is driven slowly at first and ultimately very fast, this emergence of man, the toolmaker, Homo faber. That's why I've been particularly preoccupied about hands. So much so that I haven't really answered your question, and I've therefore forgotten what your question was.
The second part is, now that the human hand has gone through so many stages of evolution, what is yet to be revealed and unfurled? What do you think is going to happen?
Gosh, I've forgotten who said it, but everything is difficult to predict, especially the future. It's quite difficult sometimes to predict the past in terms of how we're going to interpret the past. I think it's very difficult to know. It depends very much on accident. If you think of the accidents that have driven what's happened globally in the last 100 years, it depends very much on whether there is sufficient cooperation to head off the climate catastrophe, which we all know about. I mean, if we have a climate catastrophe and en route to complete extinction of absolutely everything, we have battles, wars, etc., and clearly there's not much of a future. If by some miracle we all actually work together in a just way to head off the climate catastrophe, then I can imagine a life in which less and less of our time is devoted to labor, to work. We can be liberated to start developing our interests and so on and so forth. Whether the interests that people develop will be genuinely spiritual interests or merely more consumption is very difficult to say. But I think one of the central roles of philosophers is to try and steer collective human consciousness away from consumption towards a joyful appreciation of what is before us, to see the given of our lives as a gift. And that is certainly one of my ambitions in writing books, to instill, awaken, refresh the sense of wonder. So that's not at all an answer to your question. It's just a suggestion of one or two scenarios that may unfold in the future. But I feel anybody who thinks they can predict what the world's going to be like in 10 years' time is probably deceiving themselves.
In this regard, I would like to ask you, there are many spiritual teachings around, and there are established religions. And is there something about the way you think of science and biology that resonates in any of these teachings? Have you seen anything resonating between science and spirituality? Something that is common as a biologist, what you see?
I don't think I can. I mean, that is to say that particular specific relationships. I mean, many scientists are atheists or secular humanists like myself. I think it's now probably the majority of scientists. But many scientists also have deep religious beliefs. And certainly many scientists respect people who have religious beliefs because they see it as a response to the mystery and wonder of the world. But I don't think there is any, as it were, particular religious consequences from specific developments in biology. Some people felt that Darwin's theory of evolution basically removed the necessity for a God. But actually, even though I'm an atheist, a secular humanist, I have to tell those people that A, Darwin doesn't explain why there is something rather than nothing. Darwin doesn't explain really how life originated. Once it originated, then it can compete to evolve. And most importantly for me, it doesn't explain how consciousness arose in the cosmos and what function consciousness served. Now, for many scientists, it seems to me that Darwinism has set aside the need for a creator, that we've no need for a, as it were, designer, because design is built into the process of natural selection, or rather it happens by accident. It isn't something that is driven consciously by a deity, for example. I think that's true, but I don't think Darwinism, and I speak as a secular humanist, I don't think Darwinism, as it were, sets aside or deals with all of those problems that has led people to invoke a creator. First of all, Darwinism doesn't explain why there's something rather than nothing. It doesn't explain the origin of life. Once we've got life, then we can talk about natural selection and so on and so forth. But the emergence of life is something that remains profoundly puzzling. And the third is something I've touched on before, which is the emergence of conscious life, of sentience, and ultimately conscious subjects like you and me. Consciousness, there doesn't seem to be any process by which consciousness could emerge from unconscious matter. And Darwinism certainly doesn't offer an explanation of that, in particular because it's very difficult to see what value consciousness brings, what it serves. And it is interesting that as scientists, we do believe there was a world before sentience consciousness emerged. There is a story, the standard story of the Big Bang, ultimately giving rise to the planets, ultimately giving rise to the Earth, in turn, the Earth being a place where life emerges and where eventually conscious life emerges. So we do accept that from the greater part of the history of the universe, there's been no consciousness. So the emergence of consciousness remains unexplained. Darwin's theory is absolutely extraordinary, it's brilliant, it's wide-ranging, and even more impressively, it has been strengthened by all sorts of discoveries and technologies that Darwin was completely unaware of when The Origin of Species was published back in 1859. The filling in of the fossil record, the carbon dating, discovery of continental drift, genomics, genetics, etc. All of that has come since Darwin, and all has made Darwin's theory stronger. So that's what makes it impressive. But nonetheless, it doesn't address those, what you might call metaphysical problems that I've just listed.
That brings us to the question, to the topic of wonder. So, how does an atheist see wonder? Because when you are following, or when you attribute the unknown into the hands of something unknown and call it God, and there is a lot of wonder, it's easy to wonder that way.
Yes, I mean,
how do you wonder? How does a scientist or an atheist wonder?
Just by looking at what's in front of my nose. Basically, what is in front of me is astonishing, largely unexplained, and indeed what's behind my nose, namely me, is astonishing and largely unexplained. I mean, when I die, I will die not knowing what kind of entity I was, not understanding how it is that I am aware of myself, I'm aware of a world, I have knowledge. Knowledge is the great mystery, the idea you can, as it were, be in contact with something without being fully, I do apologize, a phone has rung, and
please go ahead, please
go back over. I don't think there is a shortage of sources of wonder for anyone who is an atheist or who is a secular humanist. By the way, I'd rather describe myself as a secular humanist rather than an atheist, because an atheist would define me by what I don't believe in, whereas of course I do believe in many things. Perhaps the difference between wonder as it applies or as it's experienced by a secular humanist and wonder as it is embraced by people who have religious beliefs is that in the latter case, they gather up their sense of wonder into, as it were, the intuition of some God or other entity that has created everything. Doesn't make the wonder any less if there isn't a creator or if there isn't a place in which that sense of wonder can be gathered. And essentially, to experience wonder, one's just got to look at what's in front of one's nose, the complexity, the richness, the variety of things on the one hand, and indeed what's behind one's nose. For example, my sense of myself, my feeling of what I am, my capacity to think, my capacity to articulate things, the fact that I'm aware of things outside of me. I mean, think of this. At the moment, I'm holding a cup in my hand. I'm seeing that cup. How am I seeing it? Well, one account of it is that the light from the cup, or light bounces off the cup, enters my eye, tickles up my retina, tickles up the visual pathways, and hence the visual cortex. That's a standard story. And of course, that's an important part of the story. But it isn't the whole story, because that causal chain would end in my visual cortex. It would explain how the light gets in and what it does when it gets in. What it doesn't explain is how the gaze then looks out, how I, as it were, look up the causal chain to see that cup as the source of the light that came from it. So wonder is to be found even in something as simple as looking at a cup. It's to be found in the realization of my free will in picking up the cup. I decide I'm going to pick up the cup to demonstrate to you my picking up the cup. Well, that itself is an extraordinary thing to do. Elsewhere in the cosmos, there isn't this kind of sentience, nor is this kind of intention and purpose in which as it illustrated by something as simple as my picking up a cup. So wonder is all around, and it's just a question of focusing on it for us secular humanists, even if we don't gather it up into the idea of a deity or of some kind of spiritual entity that has created everything and the way it's set out.
I have 4 questions to go. I will start with the first 2 questions are together because you were talking about free will. Is there, in other species, we see knowledge, inbuilt knowledge, which is, again, as part of evolution, biological knowledge. Birds fly the direction, the way they fly, they have a memory of it, and other species have memory. And do we have biological memory and knowledge that can, if we pay attention to that, could lead us into common well-being, which we spoke about earlier, biologist utopia. I mean, general sense of utopia, sense of well-being. Is there a biological memory or knowledge, something that stands out that we can use for our own well-being as we progress?
Yes, I'm not sure biology necessarily is about bringing about well-being. Nature is reared in tooth and claw, and basically evolution has depended upon death and destruction. The success of the predator over the prey, the fact that species that have a particular feature will survive and others die, and so on and so forth. So there's not much well-being in nature. I would think if you were to summarize what happens in nature, it is either insentience, lack of sensation or consciousness, or often suffering. So I don't think I would expect to find, as it were, a source of primordial well-being if I were to dig deep into my own status as, to some extent, a natural object. You mentioned also memory, and it's interesting. Clearly, animals do have memories. Swallows come back year after year to make their nests in the same houses 6,000 miles after 6,000 miles of migration and so on. But that's not an explicit memory in the way that you and I have. Something that appears to be unique to humans, and it's absolutely central to our sense of what we are, is what is called autonoetic memory or autobiographical memory. So when I remember what I did yesterday, I can remember not only the event that happened, but that it was I that did it. And in fact, that is reinforced when I share it with others. I mean, so much of our joy of being with others is to remember things together. That kind of autonoetic memory doesn't seem to be present in animals. And then the question of freedom. Clearly, there is some expression of freedom in animals, but what is unique about our freedom is that it's expressed in actions that are driven by explicit possibilities that we entertain. So, for example, my freedom consisted in fulfilling an appointment that you and I made with each other quite some time ago. But I had this sense of the possibility of meeting you and talking with you, and then I so act as to realize that possibility. There doesn't seem to be much evidence in animals of the sense of realizing explicit, entertained, and often shared possibilities. So because we are so different from beasts, because I think the story of biology is one of suffering rather than joy, I feel that we're probably not going to, as it were, find much either of comfort or illumination from digging deeper into our biology. Perhaps the only thing is it should make us humble. I know that ultimately I didn't put myself together. I grew in my mother's womb as a result of biological processes. And I probably won't choose how or why I die. And I have very little role in maintaining my body. My kidneys have never spoken to each other. Kidneys just get on with the job. So in that sense, there is that humbling feeling of being constrained by nature, but I don't necessarily feel that translates into a sense of being illuminated or illuminated about my own nature by simply, as it were, digging deep into biology.
My next question to you is on free will, and sorry, sir, you were continuing. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I'm free will. Yes, it's the topic of my most recent book, and essentially, free will seems impossible in theory, because actions like the one I'm performing at the moment are, in one sense, physical events. And it would appear that if we accept what science tells us, all physical events are subject to what are called the laws of nature. So how can I be free? How can I divert the direction of events if those events are all subject to the laws of nature? And in the book, I argue that we need to look very critically at the notion of the laws of nature. Of course, nature has habitual ways of unfolding, but it's we as scientists who unpack those habitual ways of unfolding as very specific laws, so-called laws of science, which we then utilize in order to manipulate nature. And the evidence that we do manipulate nature using the laws of science is all around us, that landscape of artifacts that I talked about before. But it's astonishing to look at somebody, a scientist in a laboratory. Yes, as a body, he, as a biological organism, he is subject to the laws of nature, apparently, or the habits of nature, but he's able to stand back to manipulate nature in order to reveal those habits as laws which she or he can then use. And that is a striking example of how we can reconcile a deterministic nature, of which we in one sense are part, and our ability to manipulate nature from the outside and to express our wishes and so on in free agency.
Also spoken about neuroscience, and you're quite critical about that discipline, and you speak about neuromythology. Could you throw us some light about these things?
I have no problem with neuroscience. My gosh, all my research was in neuroscience, and I hope it helped a little bit. And certainly neuroscience is probably one of the greatest sciences. It brings together so much. My problem is not, therefore, with neuroscience, but with neuroscientism, the notion that neuroscience, the science of the brain, can explain what we are. And I feel there are many respects in which not only does brain science fail to explain what we are at present, but will always do so. First of all, it cannot handle or explain something I referred to before, which is my awareness of things other than me. That awareness, that intentional consciousness, simply cannot be observed through the lens of neuroscience. But at a higher level, there are other things that can't be observed. Free will seems impossible, although it's a reality. The unification of the self seems impossible, although it's a reality. I am unified. I still feel myself responsible for what mistakes I made when I was a junior doctor in the 1970s. I am coherent in that way. I'm also coherent at any moment. As I'm sitting here, I can hear my voice, I can see my hands, I can feel the pressure on me as I sit on the chair. I can see your face, dozens of things, and they all come together in a moment of consciousness. And there is nothing in science that can explain how these things can come together and yet be separately attended to, how merging without mushing. And the third thing that's absent in neuroscience, and will always remain so, is tensed time, past, present, and future, which are absolutely central to our lives. There is no tensed time in the physical world, as Einstein and many others have pointed out. And yet tensed time is absolutely central to myself, or what I am, and my sense of what I am, and my capacity to bring about things. A brain at time t1 is confined to the brain at time t1. Raymond Tallis at time t1 is already drawing on his explicit past and thinking about an explicit future as he makes sense of his life and acts as an agent. None of that could possibly be picked up by a brain that's seen as a material object, in whose activity is essentially electrochemical.
Yeah. My last question to you is, there is a lot of conflicting ideas that are flowing about how biology defines who we are in the sense of gender, if you're a male or a female. And there's a lot of ideas that are, hitting us every day. How, as a biologist who worked for so many years, look at these trends, and what can you tell us about these things and why they are happening and how they will, form societies and in the future?
I think a lot of the controversy around this topic has been due to confusing gender, which is a social construct, and biological sex. Clearly, there's absolutely no reason why a woman shouldn't be an engineer or a surgeon or doing all those jobs which have typically been confined to men over history. That is clearly ridiculous. Likewise, there's no reason why a man shouldn't do jobs, whether it's being a cleaner or a ballet dancer or whatever, that have often been ascribed or typically ascribed to women. So that's gender as a social construct, which hopefully will slowly but surely be liberalized and no longer imprison individuals in expectations, in a narrow range of expectations. It's different in the case of sex. I cannot basically have a baby because I don't have a womb. And there are many things that result from being biological male or a biological female, but they don't impinge on those things, or shouldn't impinge on those things that determine the life chances of individuals. There should be no limitation on individuals' life chances just coming from their biological sex.
Professor Talis, thank you so much for taking this time and patiently answering our questions. We hope this video reaches people and is useful to people who would like to make up their mind about or get their questions answered regarding the topics that we discussed today. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
It's been a real pleasure.
A conversation with Dr. Talis helped us see science as an outlook, a way suited to explore some ideas better than others, related to what it means or could mean to be human. It showed us the limits of science, along with its extraordinary potential. It also reinstated the importance of wonder, simply by acknowledging the fact that we humans have this amazing ability to wonder about things, whether they be right in front of our nose or behind it. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation, and if it inspired your worldview in any way, thanks for being here. We will see you soon with another interesting mind demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.